The scaly alien recoiled in shock, clutching its chest as if struck by a heart attack, when it glimpsed the human's strange, furry beast slinking behind him. Keith Hill knew the genetically enhanced ferret at his heels would be his secret weapon as he confronted the unknown threats lurking on this eerie alien world. The human zoologist had eagerly accepted the assignment to study Sauria's mysterious fauna, his curiosity piqued by whispers of undiscovered species and potentially groundbreaking medical advances. But as he followed his reptilian Gorn guide Tharos through the dilapidated outpost on the misty swamp's edge, a sense of unease crept up his spine. Tharos's repeated warnings of the deadly creatures stalking the bog rang in Keith's ears. As darkness fell and strange sounds pierced the night, Keith felt a chill despite Tharos's assurances that the outpost was secure. He reached down to scoop up Bandit, the ferret trembling against his chest. Keith knew he would need his faithful companion's enhanced senses and agility to survive this treacherous world, for the key to humanity's future breakthroughs could lie hidden in Sauria's mists. But as glowing eyes pierced the shadows outside, Keith wondered if he was ready to face the horrors that awaited him. One misstep, and he could become another victim of this deceptively serene alien swamp. His mission failed, and humanity's hopes dashed. He steeled himself, knowing he must push forward despite the danger. For the sake of his species and the tantalizing promise of knowledge, he would brave Sauria's darkest secrets, no matter the cost. Keith jolted awake, heart pounding, a thin sheen of sweat coating his skin. Something was wrong. He reached for Bandit, needing the reassuring touch of his companion's fur, but his hand met only empty air. Keith leapt from his cot, frantically searching the small room. No sign of the ferret. "Bandit!" Keith called, his voice echoing off the metal walls. He tore through the outpost, checking every nook and cranny, but Bandit was nowhere to be found. Panic rising in his throat, Keith burst outside, scanning the misty swamp. "Looking for something?" Tharos's voice startled Keith. The Gorn stood nearby, head cocked, eyes unreadable. "Bandit's gone," Keith said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I can't find him anywhere." Tharos shrugged, unconcerned. "Perhaps your little friend wandered off into the swamp during the night. Creatures do strange things here." Keith shook his head vehemently. "No, he wouldn't just leave. Something must have happened to him. We have to search for him." Tharos sighed, clearly reluctant, but nodded. "Very well, but we must be careful. The swamp is treacherous." As they ventured into the dense, fog-shrouded wilderness, an eerie silence enveloped them. Keith's eyes were drawn to the ground, where strange tracks marked the soft mud. They were unlike anything he had ever seen, a bizarre combination of reptilian and mammalian prints. Tharos grew increasingly agitated as they followed the tracks deeper into the swamp. His eyes darted nervously from side to side, and his scales took on a sickly pallor. Keith's unease grew with every step, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. Suddenly a piercing shriek rent the air, followed by a series of low guttural growls. Tharos froze, his scales turning a deathly shade of green. "We must leave," he whispered urgently. "Now." But before they could retreat, a massive, shadowy figure emerged from the mist. It was a creature that defied description, a nightmarish fusion of reptile and mammal, with razor-sharp claws and a mouthful of jagged teeth, and in its jaws it held the limp, lifeless body of Bandit. A cry of anguish tore from Keith's throat, and he charged towards the creature, heedless of the danger. But Tharos grabbed him, dragging him back towards the outpost with surprising strength. Keith struggled against the Gorn's grip, but Tharos held fast. Behind them the creature gave chase, its heavy footfalls growing louder with each passing second. They barely made it back to the outpost, slamming the door shut just as the creature's claws raked against the metal. Inside, Tharos collapsed against the wall, chest heaving. He fixed Keith with a look of mingled fear and anger. "You fool," he rasped. "You have no idea what you've done." Keith slumped against the wall, his mind reeling from the night's events. He stared at Tharos, anger and disbelief etched on his face. "What the hell was that thing?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "And don't even think about lying to me." Tharos sighed, his shoulders sagging. "It's called a Vorax," he said, his voice low and resigned. "They're an ancient species, highly intelligent and incredibly aggressive. My people have been studying them in secret for years." Keith's eyes narrowed. "Studying them for what purpose?" Tharos hesitated, then shook his head. "The Vorax were once the apex predators of Soria. They ruled this world until my ancestors drove them to the brink of extinction. Now only a handful remain, deep within the swamps." Keith's mind raced, trying to process this new information. "Why didn't you tell me about them? Why keep it a secret?" Tharos looked away, his voice strained. "The Gorn government strictly controls all knowledge of the Vorax. They fear that if the truth were to get out, it would cause widespread panic." Keith opened his mouth to respond, but a sudden chime from his communicator interrupted him. He glanced down, his eyes widening as he read the message from his research team back on Earth. "This can't be right," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Tharos looked at him, concern etched on his scaly features. "What is it?" Keith looked up, his face pale. "Bandits' genetic modifications. They're not of human origin. They match samples from an unknown alien species." Tharos's eyes widened and he took a step back. Keith advanced on him, his voice rising. "Bandit wasn't just a genetically modified ferret, was he? He was a hybrid, created from the DNA of a Vorax and an Earth animal." Tharos's scales turned a sickly shade of green, and he nodded slowly. "Yes, the Gorn have been experimenting with Vorax DNA for years, trying to harness their strength and intelligence for military purposes." Keith felt a wave of nausea wash over him. "And my arrival on Soria? That was no coincidence, was it?" Tharos shook his head. "No. The Gorn government specifically requested you because of your expertise in genetic modification. They hoped you could help them perfect their Vorax hybrids." Keith staggered back, horror and disgust written on his face. He realized that Bandit, his beloved companion, had been nothing more than a test subject in a twisted experiment. Suddenly, a commotion outside the outpost caught their attention. Keith rushed to the window, his blood running cold at the sight that greeted him. A group of Gorn soldiers, armed to the teeth with advanced weapons, were approaching the outpost, and at their feet several smaller creatures scurried, their forms disturbingly similar to bandits. Tharos joined him at the window, his expression grim. "They know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're here for you." Keith turned to face him, fear and determination warring in his eyes. He knew that he was in for the fight of his life, and that the secrets of Soria were far darker and more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. But he also knew that he had no choice but to confront the truth, no matter the cost. Keith's heart hammered in his chest as he and Tharos burst from the outpost, the sound of the Gorn soldiers' heavy boots pounding behind them. They raced into the swamp, the dense foliage swallowing them up as they pushed through the tangled vines and twisted roots. Keith's mind raced as they ran, questions swirling in his head. Why were the Gorn so desperate to keep their Vorax experiments a secret? And what did they want with him now that he knew the truth? Suddenly, a series of high-pitched shrieks pierced the air behind them. Keith risked a glance over his shoulder and felt his blood run cold. A pack of Vorax hybrids was hot on their heels, their eyes glowing an eerie green in the dim light of the swamp. The creatures moved with unnatural speed and agility, their powerful legs propelling them forward at an alarming rate. Keith and Tharos pushed themselves harder, their lungs burning with the effort. But it was no use. The hybrids were gaining on them, their snarls growing louder with each passing second. Just as Keith was certain they were about to be overtaken, a massive shape burst from the undergrowth beside them. It slammed into the lead hybrid, sending it flying through the air with a sickening crunch. Keith stared in disbelief as the Vorax that had killed Bandit turned to face the other hybrids, its massive frame blocking their path. The creatures hesitated, clearly torn between their instinct to attack and their fear of the larger predator. Tharos grabbed Keith's arm, yanking him forward. "Come on," he hissed. "We have to keep moving." They plunged deeper into the swamp, the sounds of the battle fading behind them. After what felt like an eternity, they finally slowed to a stop, their chests heaving as they gulped in the damp air. Tharos leaned against a tree, his scales glistening with sweat. "I have a theory," he said between breaths, "about the Voraks." Keith looked at him, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I don't think they're just mindless beasts," Tharos said. "I think they're highly intelligent with their own language and culture, and I think the Gorn's experiments have somehow awakened that intelligence." Keith shook his head, skeptical, but as they pushed on through the swamp, he began to notice signs that suggested Tharos might be right. Strange carvings on ancient ruins depicting what looked like an advanced Voraks civilization, a hidden chamber filled with technology far beyond anything the Gorn possessed. Suddenly a sound sent chills down Keith's spine, the click of weapons being armed. He and Tharos turned to see a group of Gorn soldiers emerging from the shadows, their eyes cold and merciless. The leader stepped forward, his voice like gravel. "Dr. Hill," he said, "you have seen too much, now you must come with us." Keith and Tharos were dragged before a secret Gorn military tribunal, their hands bound and their hearts heavy with dread. The room was cold and sterile, the walls lined with screens displaying images of the Voraks hybrids. The Gorn commander stood before them, his scales glinting in the harsh light. "Dr. Hill, Dr. Tharos," he hissed, "you stand accused of treason against the Gorn Empire." Keith's eyes widened as the commander revealed the full extent of the Gorn's experiments. They had been trying to create a new breed of super soldiers, combining Voraks DNA with that of other species, including humans. Bandit had been just one of many test subjects, and Keith's expertise had been meant to help perfect the process. But the experiments had gone horribly wrong. The hybrids had developed a hive-mind intelligence, allowing them to communicate and coordinate across vast distances. As their numbers grew, they began to resist their Gorn masters, plotting to overthrow them and establish a new order on Soria. The Gorn leadership, desperate to contain the situation, had decided to terminate the entire program. They ordered the destruction of all Voraks hybrids, including those still in the swamp. And Keith and Tharos were to be executed as well, to ensure that no knowledge of the experiments ever left Soria. As they were led away to their fate, Keith caught Tharos's eye. In that moment, an unspoken agreement passed between them. They had to escape, or die trying. Suddenly, Keith stumbled, crying out in pain. The guards paused distracted, and Tharos seized his chance. He lashed out with a powerful kick, sending one guard crashing to the floor. Keith, despite his feigned injury, sprang into action, grappling with the other guard for his weapon. In the chaos, they managed to overpower their captors and flee into the swamp. But not before Keith was hit by a stray blast, the searing pain in his side telling him the wound was grave. Tharos half-carried, half-dragged Keith deeper into the wilderness, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them. He knew their only hope was to reach the Voraks and beg for their protection. As Keith's life ebbed away, his blood staining the muddy ground, they finally encountered the Voraks leader, the same creature that had killed Bandit and later saved their lives. In a moment of clarity, Keith realized that Bandit's sacrifice had not been in vain. His unique genetic makeup had allowed the Voraks to finally bridge the gap between their species and communicate with the outside world. With his dying breath, Keith pleaded with the Voraks to spare Tharos and to use their knowledge to forge a new path for Soria, one free from the tyranny and oppression of the Gorn. The Voraks leader regarded Keith with an inscrutable expression, then turned and disappeared into the mists, leaving Tharos alone with Keith's body. In the distance, the sounds of battle raged as the Voraks hybrids clashed with the Gorn military. Tharos knew that the future of Soria hung in the balance, and that Keith's legacy would be one of either salvation or damnation for the planet and its inhabitants. With a heavy heart, Tharos began the long journey back to civilization, carrying with him the weight of the terrible knowledge he had gained and the sacrifice of a brave human who had given his life for a chance at a better future. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.